Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So can everyone see that okay? Assume so. Okay. Right. Well, let me just start by saying that, so I work at Cold Spring Harbor Lab, and what I want to do really is give you a perspective of different careers and science publishing in particular, sort of coming from the perspective of somebody moving out of a research institute. So Cold Spring Harbor Lab is a nonprofit research institute in New York. We have 600 staff and research groups covering molecular biology, cancer, neuroscience, plant biology, genomics, bioinformatics. But we also have, in fact, an even longer history of scientific communication. The first courses were held at Cold Spring Harbor more than 100 years ago, and sort of typically 8,000 attendees come to meetings at Cold Spring Harbor every year. Obviously, that has not happened for the past 2 years. We also have a think tank called the Banbury Center and a meetings campus in Suzhou in China. We have a graduate school. We do residential lab and lecture courses to teach people new techniques in molecular biology. And we have the DNA Learning Center, which teaches high school kids in Brooklyn, Harlem, and Long Island about DNA and recombinant DNA technology. And then we have Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, where I work, and we publish a number of journals, books, and host of preprint servers, bioRxiv and medRxiv. Seem to have lost control. It's a delay on my, are you seeing this okay? Okay, sorry about that. There seems to be a delay here. So this is just a spectrum of some of the things we publish. As you can see, we publish textbooks, manuals, history of science books, handbooks like guides for new PIs, and as was mentioned earlier, the career options book that I edited. We also have research journals like Genes and Development and Genome Research that you might know, review journals like Cold Spring Harbor Perspectives in Biology and Medicine and Cold Spring Harbor Protocols, and the preprint servers bioRxiv and medRxiv. So in thinking about careers, I actually stole this slide from a colleague of mine, David McCandlish, who's a PI in bioinformatics here at Cold Spring Harbor. And this was the start of one of his talks, where I thought was quite nice, where he placed himself on his career trajectory somewhere between birth and death. And he was kind of like halfway through in starting as a young PI. And it made me think of what's the kind of like idealized career timeline for a molecular biologist. And it looks something like this. You get your bachelor's degree at some point in your early 20s, do a PhD, move on to a postdoc. In your 30s, you're offered a tenure track position. With luck, by the time you're sort of in your early 40s, you've got tenure, make full professor by 50. And then in your sort of older years, you're elected to the National Academy and win the Nobel Prize before you retire. And of course, this is a fiction. This doesn't happen. Hardly anyone gets a Nobel Prize, and very, very few people are elected to the National Academy. But actually, it's much more of a fiction than this, because actually the reality is that the vast majority of people don't go on to permanent scientific positions and don't progress beyond a postdoc. And in fact, one of the things that we might discuss later is whether you even do that, because a substantial number of people do not move. So I'm still having trouble controlling this. Do not even move beyond a PhD and move out of science at that point. And the reason for this is that we generate larger and larger numbers of PhD students, but there's not an equivalent increase in the number of faculty positions. This is from an article in Nature several years ago. You can see the blue curves show the number of PhD positions, an increase in numbers of PhDs, and the beige lines are the faculty positions, which remain rather constant. And this has led to a number of kind of articles in the popular press and in the scientific press talking about, the PhD factory. Are we producing too many PhD scientists? The disposable academic, doing a PhD is often a waste of time. And all highlighting this difference between the number of faculty positions and the number of PhD positions that are being churned out. And this was quantified by the Royal Society in Britain a few years ago, and this is an article in Nature talking about that, showing that only 3.5% of graduates, PhD graduates, go on to have university positions, and only 0.5% of them make it to professor level in a research department. So this is a chart that kind of shows the progress through the system. This is data for Britain, and you'll see, you know, very early on, about half the people exit from the academic workforce. Some of them go on to permanent or quasi-permanent positions, but then cycle out of it or move into government, and you get that 3.5% figure ending up in permanent positions, and 0.5% ending as professors. Now, the interesting thing here was I actually posted this on Twitter a few years ago, and somebody immediately jumped down my throat and said, "Oh no, this is totally wrong. They've reanalyzed the data. It's not 3.5% of people who get permanent positions. It's 6%." To which my response was, "Wow, a whopping 6%. So that means you've got a 1 in 16 chance, not a 1 in 33 chance." It's really, you know, I mean, the point is most people are not progressing through. And actually, if you look at the R0, a sort of a concept I guess we're all more familiar with over the past 2 years, but if you look at the R0 for biomed, this is the number of graduate students that the average PI will train in their lifetime, and it's about 13. So that means that, you know, as a PI, I will train 13 graduate students, but when I retire, there will be 1 position vacated for somebody to come along and enter a tenure track position. So that's sort of the other 12 will not be able to progress without an increase in faculty number, which, as we've seen, isn't occurring. So I'm continuing to have some trouble here with this. It doesn't normally happen. I'm sorry about this. So what this means is that when we talk about the so-called alternative careers, that's actually a misnomer. These aren't alternative careers. If you move out of science, the alternative career is to remain in science, because something like 95% of people are moving out. Now, there's some very good news, which is that if you have a PhD, unemployment is incredibly low. I think in the US, it's around 2%. So it's not that these people are cast out of the scientific labor force and then, you know, sort of end up unemployed. They do get jobs. And the skills that you learn during a PhD are valued, and there are lots of professions where people really like to have people who have PhDs. These are just a few examples which we used for the cover of our recent book. So management, I have one of my best friends from my PhD went to become a management consultant at McKinsey. They were exclusively hiring people with PhDs. If you go into patent law, working in biological sciences, they want you to have a PhD. Scientific publishing, the same, working in grant administration, science policy, various foundations or core facility management and academic administration. All of these things are things that will require a PhD. So it's a good thing to have for that sake. More sobering is the fact that these professions are incredibly competitive. I mean, we see this when we advertise editorial jobs. Large numbers of people apply, you know, because you've got that 95% who are moving out and they need other jobs there. So there are tens to hundreds of applications for every position. And it's absolutely, I'll come back to this later, it's absolutely critical that you can display evidence of your interest and your potential in that career. And it's not something that anybody should ever think of as an easy way out, exiting academia. Just for example, if you go and work in patent law, you're going to have to go and get a law degree. That's not an easy way out. If you go and work in management consultancy, they will train you very hard and they will want you to get an MBA. If you work in science publishing, you'll have to expand your knowledge of science, not reduce it. So we shouldn't think of these as an easy way out. When you move out of the academic environment, there are also a number of challenges. The organizational hierarchy looks very different from an academic hierarchy. You know, you have, rather than the PI controlling things or being the master of your own destiny as an independent scientist. You can be in a mission, customer, investor-driven environment where somebody else is calling the shots, other factors are there, and so you may have to change project because the company decides to move in a different direction. So it is very, very different from what I often describe as the sort of intellectual fiefdoms that make up academia and the classic academic environments in research institutes and at universities. Another thing that will be a challenge is often you have to master a completely new skill set, and you're effectively in an entry-level position. You will train for many years doing your BA and then your PhD and possibly a postdoc. So you're a real expert in what you do. You then move into another environment that is very different. There'll be a lot of people there who don't necessarily have PhDs, and you will have to learn, you're on the ground floor again. And that's always a challenge for people. So what I wanted to do now was move, having talked a little bit more generally about academic careers, to talk specifically about careers in publishing for those who might be interested. And I think there's some sort of aspects here that also can be generalized to other careers. This is the sort of classic organogram, the hierarchical structure within a publishing company or a non-profit like I work where you have a publisher, and then you have a number of different departments: advertising, sales and marketing, areas where you have people who are specifically trained in those areas. You do not tend to have people with biomedical PhDs working in sales and marketing or advertising. Similarly, in IT, there will be IT professionals. And in production, this is something that's increasingly outsourced, but there are production staff in publishers. But again, they tend to be people who were trained, traditionally in desktop publishing, not PhDs. Though some people do move into that. But what you're really talking about for somebody with a PhD is working in the editorial department. And there, the entry-level jobs are things like assistant editor or copy editor. And then as you progress through your career, you could become an associate editor, executive editor, managing editor, editorial director, through potentially then to publisher. These are the different roles. To break it down a little bit more, I've highlighted in green the ones that are typically occupied by people who would leave science with a PhD. So one job you may have heard of is a copy editor. That does not necessitate a PhD. A copy editor or a sub-editor is somebody who essentially rewrites text for authors. They improve the language, they correct the punctuation, they spot the errors, they check it all reads correctly. You see those on newspapers. Many high quality scientific journals will have these. Sometimes those people have PhDs, sometimes they may have degrees in the humanities. It's really more about your English than your science there. Another area that we can perhaps talk about in the QA a little bit later is a writer, a science writer. That's really a journalistic role. Some of those people will have PhDs. Increasingly, they do in science, but that's journalism rather than publishing. And again, we can talk about that a little bit later. A desk editor is essentially somebody who traffics manuscripts. It's a sort of administrative, organizational role where you will work at a journal. Often these people again don't have training in the area of the journal. They're just checking that the trains run on time, making things happen in an administrative role. So the two jobs that are really the sort of thing that you would be much more likely to move into from a PhD in biomedical science are a research or manuscript editor, or reviews or commissioning editor. So a research manuscript editor is basically, they are the people who make the decisions on papers. If you're an editor at Nature or Science or somewhere like Cell, the papers come into you, you read them, and you make the decisions. You choose the referees, and your scientific knowledge and your growing scientific knowledge and your decision about the quality of papers, your ability to assess referees' reports and make judgments on papers is what you're being hired for. A reviews editor or commissioning editor is slightly different. Again, you're dealing with manuscripts, but you're typically dealing with review articles. And what you're doing there is you are selecting people to write articles. So typically a reviews editor will go to conferences, find interesting areas and try and persuade people to write on them. They will then work with the author and take those papers through peer review. And that's a number of journals have reviews editors. A commissioning editor is basically a more general category of this, that, you know, you could be commissioning pieces on news and views, a variety of different things. There's another role you may come across called a developmental editor. These are more common in book publishing, in textbook publishing. It's a bit like a copy editor. What you're really doing here is you're improving text that the authors have written. So if somebody writes a textbook, then the developmental editor will work with the author to make the writing better and to make the science better. And the big distinction between a developmental editor and a copy editor is that the developmental editor, as well as being concerned with the language, is also concerned with the concepts and the understanding. So the science is important. So these people have PhDs. And then as you move further through the career structure, there are jobs like managing editor or executive editor, where you may be you may be the boss of a number of editors beneath you. You could have total control of a journal or several journals, and really you're responsible for making things happen on them. And then an acquisitions editor, which was a role that I had early at Cold Spring Harbor, is essentially somebody who creates new projects, who finds new books, creates new journals. And those last two are more senior roles that you're unlikely to go into straight after a PhD, but you might well work as a reviews editor for a while before becoming an acquisitions editor, or a manuscript editor for a while before becoming the managing editor for several different titles. So as an editor, as I said, what you're really doing is you're shepherding authors through this process. This is a slide I show students at Cold Spring Harbor when we talk about the publication process. But the editor roles here are shown in red. It starts off with pre-submission inquiries. Authors will contact you saying, is my work appropriate for the journal? Should I submit this? Would you be interested? That's the earliest contact you might have with an author. At a later stage, authors will submit papers to you, the editor, and this is the point at which your scientific understanding is critical. You make an assessment about whether or not the work fits the scope of the journal, whether or not it's interesting, and if the authors have done what they say they've done, whether it's the sort of thing that you would be interested in publishing in the journal. And that that takes some time to sort of you would have on the job training to make those kinds of assessment. In some cases, in some journals, that will involve consultation with editorial board members. If you work for Science, for example, they have a big editorial board of very well-known scientists who help give opinions on the suitability of papers. But if you're at Nature, they pride themselves on not having an editorial board. So that's an interesting sort of difference in publication strategy. So if you decide that the manuscript is then potentially of interest, then what you do as an editor is you send the paper out to referees to get their opinions. So this comes back to the point I made about thinking about whether, if the authors have done what they say they've done, would it be interesting? The referees are really there to establish whether or not they have actually done what they say they've done. The referees will be experts in that specific area of science. They will read the paper very, very closely to try and establish whether what has been done is correct, and give opinions on that. And they may also give opinions on the suitability and the importance of the work to that field. Occasionally you may get a spectrum of opinion and consult another referee, that's the so-called deciding referee. Processes vary a little bit. And the most likely outcome at that stage for many journals is that the paper is rejected or it's revised. And in that case, you as the editor will make a decision about whether you're going to reject the paper, whether the points made by the referees are something that the authors can address by rewriting the paper. Maybe the claims are overstated. Maybe there's some kind of errors in the logic. And basically, if the authors can address those, then the paper's fine. That would be called a minor revision. If, however, it's clear from the referee's reports that the authors have not done enough, they need to do some more work before a judgment can be made, then that would be a major revision that requires the author to do new experiments. In both cases, the paper goes back to the author, and at that point, you know, they will resubmit it. They may rebut it, so there may be some to and fro. And ultimately, the hope is that all of this is resolved, and at some point the paper is accepted. You will then oversee checking of the ethics for the paper. There may be plagiarism checks, the images may be screened for manipulation, that type of thing. If all that happens, the paper's accepted, and you as an editor pass it on to production. The role is pretty similar if you're a reviews editor, the difference being you will spend a lot more time at the beginning of the process in solicitation of the manuscript, and you'll typically spend a lot of time working with the author to improve the text and make it more relevant and easier to read. What do you need? What skill set do you need as an editor? The critical thing is that you need to have a very broad scientific interest and understanding. You know, one of the things that you find during your PhD, well, when you go from your bachelor's to your PhD, your postdoc, people tend to be focusing more and more narrowly on a very, very small area of science. When you become an editor, you then have to step back and really increase the breadth, because you will be handling a spectrum of papers. I mean, you could be, if you work for somewhere like Nature, they may say, you know, we need somebody with expertise in transcription, but you will still get papers on signal transduction and other areas. In other journals, you may have to cover a much, much wider range. So the real difference is it's almost like going back in time to when you were an undergraduate and achieving that type of breadth. It's critical to have attention to detail. You know, the word anally retentive is often used pejoratively, but for an editor, it's a necessary skill that you have to have. You have to be able to spot details. You have to pride yourself in that. Writing skills, particularly if you're a reviews editor, you have to have very good written English and very good grammar, because you will be rewriting a lot of what authors write. That's less important for a manuscript editor, but manuscript editors will also suggest changes to authors, because actually, you know, believe it or not, a lot of people write very, very badly. And so in good journals, the articles do look somewhat different when they're finally published. Another critical aspect of being an editor is being able to talk with anyone. You know, I remember when I started at Trends in Biochemical Sciences, one of the guidance was, you know, if you go to a conference and you're unsure about talking to people, you're a little bit wary about going up to the Nobel Prize winner who knows so much more than you about subject and talking to them, then that job is not for you. You have to do that as an editor. It's part of your job, and you won't enjoy it, and you won't be able to do it unless you feel able to do that. It's important to be confident and be able to stand up to anyone. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but it's actually true. Authors do phone up editors and shout at them. They get people whose papers are rejected get very, very angry on occasion, and you have to be able to accept that is going to happen, and be able to deal with that and be polite, you know, because they may not be polite to you, but you've always got to be polite to them. The other aspect that I think is a shock to some people coming out of an academic environment into a sort of mission-driven publishing environment is the production cycle and coping with the pressure of that. It's, you know, I mean, you can't just freeze down the cells. I mean, you know, there are sort of external pressures going on, that the journal has to come out every week or every 2 weeks, and a whole bunch of things have to happen. And so you have to make sure those things happen on that day. And that will be a critical part of your role and how leadership in an organization will judge you. Part of that is being able to do plate spinning and juggle many tasks at the same time at any given time in the life of an editor. There will be dealing with a bunch of new submissions and potentially having conversations with their editorial colleagues about the merits of those submissions, dealing with revisions, new papers coming in from authors, and then you will need to get back to the referees and have a discussion with the referees about what should happen with this paper. You'll be getting rebuttals from authors, essentially often complaining about your decisions. In the worst case scenario, dealing with a retraction, which is, if there's been a serious error in a paper you published or some accusation of fraud, you may have to deal with institutional leadership to get that resolved so you can retract the paper. Authors will be sending in proofs. There may be queries from production staff. There'll be press releases, which require you to interact with your colleagues in marketing. And every now and then you may need to be writing editorials yourself and conferring with publishing colleagues, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different things going on at the same time. Again, it sounds very odd to show this slide given the past 2 years, but a very important job in the life of most editors is attending meetings, meetings. I think the year before I used to live in the UK, and before I moved to the US, I realized the year before, when I was traveling from Britain into the US, I had 13 US entry stamps for that year because I was traveling so much, going to meetings. These can be big society meetings like American Society for Cell Biology or American Society of Human Genetics, specialist meetings like Gordon conferences, Keystone meetings, local meetings, lab visits, and occasionally publishing meetings, which are non-scientific but attended by people in publishing to talk about technology and processes. And so that's a very important aspect of the life of an editor ordinarily. This is just, again, a slide I show the students at Cold Spring Harbor to show the different types of journal and the journal landscape in which you might secure a job. There's the general interest journals like Cell and Nature, which have professional editors. They're often recruiting for these. There are actually a lot more positions these days because these journals have launched a host of new siblings like Molecular Cell, Nature Cell Biology, Nature Genetics. There are tons of these journals. They all require editors. So there are a lot more editorial jobs than there were. Even the traditional community journals, which are known for being edited by academics, like Journal of Cell Biology, they also employ editors on staff, again, to make the trains run on time. There's mega journals that have staff, review journals like Nature Reviews, etc. So there are a lot more editorial jobs around, which is a good thing. And the ecosystem is growing. So there are things that are not journals like Figshare, protocols.io, Faculty of 1000 Research, and bioRxiv that I co-founded. These don't have editorial jobs per se, but they have scientists involved who help make them work. And so there are jobs available there. Just in case you aren't familiar with preprints are essentially, they're kind of like journals, but without the peer review. The idea is that the work is shared before peer review. So there's no typesetting, there's no refereeing, and we operate these two surveys at Cold Spring Harbor, and they've proven very important during the pandemic. Authors like them because they get the results out much more quickly. That slide I showed earlier, it normally takes around a year for a paper to go through the process of a journal peer review and revision, etc. It's about 24 to 48 hours on bioRxiv, and it allows people to get feedback on their work much more quickly, and it's good for early career scientists to get their work out early, so they can make it available for job applications, that type of thing. There have been a lot more preprint servers launched over the years since we launched bioRxiv. It's becoming much more common phenomenon in a number of different fields. And this is a slide that I stole from Michael Eisen, and which has led people like him to propose that perhaps we don't need journals to do peer review. If there are all these preprints are out there, why do we need the journals? And I think it's a good question. And actually, you see initiatives like Prelights from the Company of Biologists, pre-review, Review Commons, and PCI. These are all new initiatives that have been spun up to do peer review based on preprints, which again suggests that journals might not be necessary. But I don't think that's actually a concern for somebody who's interested in editing, because I think we're always going to need editors. Here's another slide that I stole from Mike, and he talks about what people mean by peer review, why we need filtering of the literature. And this is because, you know, people use journals, for example, as a way to filter the literature, decide which papers they should read in the first place. There's a lot of people who will judge papers without reading them based on the title, for, you know, for good or bad. That does happen. And you know, and then there are people who are actually reading the paper and want to know whether or not the work has been executed correctly. So there's a valuable role of peer review to do all these things. It's a little bit conflated right now, but it serves that filtering function. And I would argue that we will always need editors. There will always be jobs for people to do this, because there's such a volume of literature, and it will need human eyes and human scientific skills to be able to do that. And we will need to employ people to do that. Just to talk a little bit about the hiring process. If you're interested in working as an editor, typically you submit your application to a journal, to a publishing house. There'll be a shortlist, and you will be tested. In almost any job you apply for, there'll be an editorial test. They may send you a test for you to do. They'll send you a terrible paper that's really hard to understand, that has horrible flaws in it, and you have to kind of think about what the flaws are and how it could be corrected, correct the language, etc. Then, you know, if you pass that, typically you'll have an interview with various members of the editorial team, and at that point, typically you will have further testing. You know, what most people do is they lock you in a room for an hour with 3 papers. You have to read the papers, and then they come back after an hour and ask you to talk about the merits of those papers, what the problems were, and what you would ask the authors to do. A critical aspect in thinking about applying for a job in publishing, but also in any other job beyond the bench, is being able to demonstrate that you're interested and able to do the job. Somebody like me, when I get applicants for editorial jobs, I'm flooded with applications from people who are just fed up. They want to get out of the lab. They've had enough. But I don't want to employ somebody like that. I want to employ somebody who wants to be an editor and can be an editor. So it's really important that somebody can demonstrate that to me. So when I look back at my career, you know, as was said earlier, I did my BA and then PhD, and then I went on to all these editorial jobs. But what was interesting was there were 2 things which I didn't think were very significant at the time. When I finished my PhD, I did an internship at the BBC because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to become an editor or a journalist. So I did an internship. I worked with BBC World Service on some science programs to get some experience. And that one of the things that convinced me of was that I didn't want to be a journalist, and I wanted to be an editor, not work for the BBC, but it was important. And I also worked at Cambridge University Press, just doing some fairly basic data entry type temp work, but I learned a little bit about the publication process. But critically, then I noticed when I applied for the job at Tibbs in particular, they had highlighted on my CV this fact that I had worked at Cambridge University Press, which made them think this person is interested in publishing. Look, they've actually gone and done something. And so I think it's critical to find examples of that. It's actually easier these days than it was then, because, you know, what people like me hiring potential editors want is people who can read broadly. You can do this, read widely across science so that you can discuss things far beyond just your PhD, but write and critique at any opportunity. Any opportunity you get to write for a magazine, a journal, a blog, or something like that is immensely valuable, because it means that you can provide evidence of your critical scientific ability outside your own PhD area. It will be able to showcase your skills in writing. And as I said, you know, if you have a blog, if there are university blogs you can write for, that's great. You can then send them in with your application. And those are the sorts of things that will stick out, as I showed before on when I applied for that job and had worked at CUP. Twitter is very popular among scientific journals and scientific editors. It's a really good way to interact with people in the ecosystem and learn more beyond more broadly beyond your own field, and it's an opportunity to network in general. I mean, it's always an advantage if you apply for the job and the person you're applying to has met you already. That can only help. When I think of how useful this has been in my career, this is just a few people on my Twitter network, but thinking how much this has helped me more recently with bioRxiv in particular. I think of biologists I've known for a long time, like Steve Tucker and Steve Royal. You would imagine that I would know people like this as an editor, but as we moved with medRxiv into a clinical sphere that I'm much less familiar with, being able to interact with people like Jeff Flyer at Harvard and Eric Topol from Scripps is important to have those people in my network. Funders like Corey Bargman, who runs CZI, Robert Kiley at Wellcome, and other editors like Magdalena Skipper, the editor of Nature, and Jeremy, former editor of Science. It's helpful to interact with those people, and journalists like Carl and Ed. And so, you can build a network through going to meetings and through things like Twitter. So I think that's very, very helpful, particularly early in your career. So finally, I just want to sort of wish those people who want to choose these different careers luck. I think all these lessons will apply beyond just publishing. And one thing I should have everybody remember, and we wrote this in the introduction to our book, is that these different career trajectories outside the lab aren't second rate and aren't second choice. One of the things that I found among all the editors that I've met over years is that everybody really, really likes their job. And every now and then you say to them, people say, do you ever regret leaving? Do you wish you're back? Do you ever wish you were back in the lab? And they all say, hell no. And I think this was what was interesting editing that book, talking to the people who did all these different jobs. And it was really interesting to see that they all really, really liked their jobs, and their scientific training had been immensely beneficial to their new job. And although it was very different, they didn't regret they'd done the scientific training, and they didn't regret the fact that they'd moved out of science. So really, that's all I have to say on that. Any questions, ask ahead. And sorry for some of the technical hitches along the way.